right, we'll go ahead and start the work session. Is Bill, or is it just you?
I think it's just me.
Okay.
No, he brought the map up for me. I tried to pull it up, and it's too big to open on my phone because I wanted the numbers at the bottom of it, so that's why it's there.
Okay, well, we're going to start with you.
So last week during the Board of County Commissioners, there was a request to look at the track split regulations, more specifically about lot lines created through the track split process. Currently, our regulations require that any track split that is approved administratively has to comply with the subdivision regulations and all of the design standards in those regulations. One regulation in particular, Article 50, Section 43D, requires that all side lot lines bear 90 degrees from the street right-of-way or from the tangent of a curved street, except where unusual conditions require a minor variance. It has been this department's interpretation that minor variance refers to an exception, which is outlined in Article 56. Exceptions are permissions granted by the Planning Commission, the Board of County Commissioners, through the platting process through subdivisions. So based off of that, staff has not made an interpretation that I'm aware of that a track split can receive an exception from the Planning Commission or the Board of County Commissioners unless they plat their property. I think there is one specific case in question where the applicant is wanting to create a non-parallel or perpendicular line to account for some agricultural contouring on their property. They were seeking a track split, which of course is administrative approval, so we had to go through the whole process, and it was determined that staff could not approve it. They wanted to ask why they couldn't seek an exception, and that, based off our interpretation, is what they were told. So as of this time, that is what staff, the direction that was given to them was to plat in order to be able to grant the exception. Of course, platting is a more extensive process. It requires additional studies like a drainage study, and I think the property owner was hoping to get it approved in a quicker timeline. So staff did look at what other counties' regulations were in regards to this. Specifically, we looked at Douglas, Johnson, and Wyandotte County, and that review was provided for you in that table. Douglas and Johnson do not have language pertaining to keeping property lines parallel or perpendicular to roadways. Wyandotte County did. However, it prioritizes parallel and perpendicular roadways, but they do have administrative approval to grant non-parallel and perpendicular lot lines. In regards to granting an exception or a variance from a track split, none of those counties had that option built into their regulations. The only thing that was close to what we currently have was Johnson County's regulations. When a property is requesting a track split or a lot split in their regulations, they are granted only one line, and it has to be a straight line. So they can only make one land division going through a track split. So given all of that, staff has prepared some options for you guys to look at. And I can go in depth on either of those, or maybe we can.
Well, my opinion is a lot split should have less restrictions than a plat. They should be able to come in, staff should be able to approve it. I mean, the plat we just approved earlier did not have a straight line. And it was a self-inflicted problem. Somebody put laterals on another property, somebody built a building without a building permit, but yet it passed. So somebody who did something that's non-self-inflicted on a track split, and that's the only thing they're going to do, especially when it's agriculture. It's never going to do. I just think that they ought to be able to come in here, and staff ought to be able to approve it.
So that is a kind of a good example. They had to plat it because they had to get an exception to be able to create that.
But it was already platted, that property that we just approved today. It was already platted. Then they come in and ask for a rezone. Then they came in and asked for a replat because somebody broke the rules, built a building without a building permit, built it on somebody else's property, and put laterals on somebody else's property. So we bend over backwards for that. If somebody's just coming in here to do a track split, and it's got the same crooked line as this what we just approved.
I understand. What I was going to say was they had to plat it because they could have done a boundary line adjustment and amended that line, but because it was a bent line, they had to get an exception, which meant platting.
Yes, it was platted. I understand it. But on a lot or a lot split, I don't see why you would need a drainage study. Make them go through all the platting process, all the additional costs to that. I mean, the surveyors don't want to make any money on it. But
I have a question
it was
on.
unnecessary.
I didn't want to interrupt you.
No, that's fine. Go ahead. Interrupt me anytime you want.
On this Article 50, it does have the line that clearly reads, except where unusual conditions require a minor variance. So that line is in there already.
In the regulations.
So then you add the stipulation here. It says it has been interpreted, and that's where you put the requirement that it has to go back to planning commission or so. Since the language is plainly, it could be. I mean, it depends how you read that line. It would appear that you could be authorized to have the administrative ability to make the decision yourself.
I don't think.
Commissioners, let me weigh in on that. I think we've ran into this before in other areas where we've had to make changes to our policies and procedures, because when you leave it, when there is a difference in opinion on an interpretation, we need to clarify what's in there so that there is no room for that difference of opinion. Because we may have one planning director who interprets it one way, and the next planning director interprets it another way. We had that in Public Works, I think probably 5 years ago, road improvement requirements, where we had one Public Works director that it made a determination that a roadway needed to be improved because there was no clear definition. We changed our road policies because of that. So similar here, I think what we have is maybe language that needs to be clarified so there isn't a subject to interpretation clause here, and it's more of a this is allowed or this isn't allowed. That way there's no you don't put it back on somebody's table to make an interpretation, because I can tell you that from a staff's perspective, that's where staff gets in trouble. Because if it's interpreted in a way that wasn't intended by the Board of County Commissioners, or maybe the current Board of County Commissioners doesn't interpret it the same way, then there's a difference. And then we get the staff is in the caught betwixt and between. And staff never wants to be there. We also don't want to make decisions that is contrary to what the current Board of County Commissioners believe. So if the language is clear, whichever way we want to make this, we just need to make sure that it's clear so that if it goes back to staff, they're allowed to make this exception administratively in these cases, period. There's no, well, in this case I can or I can't. That's what we're looking for here. Then, I don't refer to Johnson County too often because I think maybe sometimes they go a little over the top, but I thought that their approach was pretty good, at least in the platting, because in our platting right now, to have those jagged, I think they're called broken lines, even though that doesn't make sense to me as a non-planner or non-surveyor. But they allow broken lines in plats. It doesn't require an exception. It's just allowed. And I think that that's probably a good approach to the plats. And that's one thing. That's not addressing the other thing that brought all this up, which is the track splits. I'm not sure on the track splits if it's a one straight line is the only answer here. And I think Jeff kind of drew something up there that would be that. Actually, that picture is exactly what would be allowed in Johnson County, I believe, because it's one straight line, even though it's not a 90. But I think there's room here, and I think we understand what the board wants to accomplish. But what we're looking for more is we want to definitively say, yes, you can do these in track splits, and staff can approve them in these instances. That's what we're looking for.
And I think that's pretty much what I said. I mean, on a track split, there's no reason to make people pay for a drainage study. track split. They're not adding any houses, they're not adding any other buildings. There's not going to be any change in water.
Agree. But there probably has to be some kind of a limitation, though, so we don't have a star-shaped. And I'm being very extreme, and I know that. But, we don't. You also don't want somebody coming in with 25 different broken lines, I guess, on one track, because then you really do kill the potential for any development of that land, and you make it tough for somebody in the future to define whether that's actually their property or not. So, like the people who built the building on the property line and the laterals across the property line or both across, when you have broken lines, you increase the opportunity for that to happen, and that's what we just want to avoid that.
So if we have the specific case, and if we approve the change, it's going to have to go back to Planning Commission and through the process.
Right.
But if we approve the exception pending the policy being changed, then we're basically meeting our goal.
So that's what we discussed last time, is that if there's clear direction from this board that they want this change to happen, there's a potential that before you grant an exception, let's make sure that the new rule would allow for what you're getting ready to grant the exception for. If you're proposing a new rule, and it has to go back through all the processes, and this current application would meet those new rules, I don't know if you're allowed, and that's a question for David, if you're allowed to grant an exception. I believe you are, but I think that's a question you need to ask David.
Well, these are our rules and regulations. They're not state statutes. The caution I would offer, or go further, is since any amendment has to be considered by the Planning Commission, there's no guarantee that your marching orders to them, what their final result is going to be. They are an independent commission, and they do exercise judgment. That having been said, if you wish to grant an exception, and I'm familiar with the parcel of property that's in here, basically taking the exception language from the subdivision plat provision in your rules and regulations and provisionally inserting that into the track split rules and regulations. I think it's your prerogative to do so. I think, though, Mark cautioned you, we should be careful that staff is not put into a position in the future where it's unclear as to what extent they can exercise their administrative discretion in granting, I'll call it an unusual situation on a track split. I would hazard to say that probably 95% of all the track splits do use straight perpendicular lines. But there are going to be exceptions, and as Mark said, we do not want the dreaded star-shaped lot. You're creating future problems to address a current need, and that is always problematic. But in this specific case, Amy, jump in here. The subdivision regulations allow for exceptions based on topography, contours, etc., natural features, and you could provisionally take that language and insert that into the track split rules and regulations.
And then send it through the regular process for the final.
Yes.
It says unusual topography or other non-self-inflicted conditions.
So
We just passed and inflicted. Self-inflicted.
Right, via a plat, though. And that's the one where I think that potentially we should change our rules on platting that say we allow broken lines versus you have to get an exception for broken lines. And then on the track splits, we say you are allowed them in certain conditions, because when it's the platting that makes it easier for us to define where these lot lines are in the future. But for track splits, the language like you mentioned about topography and unusual conditions. I never liked the self-inflicted. I know that's language that's used when you're trying to do a lot of the exceptions. It can't be a self-inflicted thing, but I think a terrace could technically be defined as self-inflicted, but really you're trying to work around a terrace.
I'd like to second Mark's suggestion. If you read statutes, statute that creates the Board of Zoning Appeals. If you read the 5 factors that the Board of Zoning Appeals is supposed to consider, no variance would ever be allowed. I literally cannot think of a situation where somebody would meet all 5 of those criteria, at least not in the real world. And one of them is the one that generally pops up is the self-inflicted clause. Because if somebody terraces their farm ground 25 years ago and suddenly they want to do a track split, are you going to require them to tear that terrace up?
I don't think we can. USDA paid for it.
So I think there can be workable lines, and I'm not referring to a line on that, lines within your regulations to provide enough guidance for staff to where they can make valid administrative decisions.
So for this particular case, what you come up with, are you foreseeing that at next week's meeting you would present an exception vote and then this other would have to be voted on to send to the Planning Commission? Or would we just make the exception vote and then it would go to the Planning Commission on the recommendation of Amy?
So I think what I would like to get from the Board of County Commissioners is how much leeway do you want staff to have? What direction do you want to give staff on these track splits?
Common sense.
And then, well, but not everybody has the same
That's
common
right.
sense.
That's not, that
Well,
defines
you've got your basis
We've got
of
some.
the rule.
We've got some outlines. Yes.
What did you say? What you'd like to see?
What's that?
Can you tell us what you'd like to see?
What I'd like to see is, first I want to work with the county surveyor because I am not a surveyor. And like I said, broken lines don't, when they refer to a broken line, I think is a dashed line, right? But what they really mean is it's a non-straight line. So I would like to work with the county surveyor to make sure that the language is, one, it's understandable to both us and surveyors, and 2, it's enforceable, and then 3, come up with something that is more bright line for staff direction. And we can do that. And I think we would get to that point that what the current application would be approved administratively under those guidelines, which then you could allow an exception to that if that's what you want to do. But I need to know if that's what the county commissioner was wanting to do.
a way of, limiting the lines. I mean, so you don't end up with the star shape. I mean,
Right.
is there a way in language to, well, but there are some people have no common sense stuff. So.
Well, and some people.
not say a word. That's the problem.
We also have.
And I'm just saying, but
it is.
Well, we also have people. If the language is not clear, we'll be right back in here with what's your interpretation, and whether people like it or not. Really, the only interpretation that matters is ours.
right.
Right. So they may not agree with that interpretation, but that really
But
doesn't
you clean
matter.
it up like you're proposing, helps everybody though, Mark.
But for
Yes,
the
and that's what we want to
exception,
do.
you can go ahead and move ahead on that next week, and then this language on the final rule may take more time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And it wouldn't make it on the next planning commission meeting anyway, so we would have 30 days or so to work something out.
I don't see a problem with that.
I do encourage, what Mark suggested, using terms of art that the surveyor can provide to us, because they're surveyors speak a non-English language. And, we need to make sure- we need to make sure that the terms of art are proper.
Right. Broken and bent is just a term that was
Right.
used to try and explain the situation.
I thought that's what they did to people that came in. They broke them and
I mean, what you more commonly see is language similar to ours, but usually it's they recommend a straight line, but obviously within that language, it's just a recommendation. It's not a requirement.
And then there's certain angles that would be allowed versus not allowed to.
Right, that's
You get
what
to a
I'm
certain
saying.
point, it's just a ridiculous angle that
Yes.
makes it impossible to do anything.
Some maybe won't allow for an angled line beyond 45% from the original projection or
Right.
something along those lines. You don't want to create against like the star or something like that. The other thing that I think staff was most concerned about was what that does to lot depth to lot width
Right.
requirements. would they have to maintain the lot depth to lot width as long as one line or one side meets that? Or, because right now, most lots that are being created are squares or rectangles, that lot to depth is, maintained across the whole property. But if you allow these irregularly shaped lots, how would we interpret lot depth to lot width in regards to that?
How did we do when we just did the one today? Does it still meet?
It still meets for the most part, yes.
For the most part.
Yeah. Because we
And that's
look
a
at
plat.
one.
That's a plat
No,
with an
no,
exception.
it would meet
With an
both.
exception.
Yeah,
So
would
why
meet
would we
because-
have
it would meet
the
both.
same rules on a lot? That's just, it's,
Well, I think we kind of got the marching orders down, and you're going to have to develop the policy, right?
Well, changes to our current policy. We already
Yeah.
have a policy. We need to adopt some changes. But that, I know this wasn't really part of the original work session, but the depth to width ratio brings back to, I think Commissioner Culbertson's brought it up a couple of times about the current width to depth ratios and how the other challenges that creates, and whether or not that's really you had a good explanation as to how we came up with 300 feet and whether or not that was really a number that we had to stick to or not. But,
because your access management policy is going to determine a lot of that too.
so,
Yeah, a lot of it's based on all the way back to the state plan coordinate system. You break down a section, 640 acres, 320, 160, 80, 40, 20, 10, 5, 2.5. 2.5 is the smallest parcel you can break down in the state plan Kansas survey system. That is ideally 330 feet by 330 feet. So they use 300 just to make sure, because there are some correction sections where you get short. And so 300 feet was usually the minimum a 2.5 acre tract could feasibly be. And I just want to bring up, so, like, the main reason that we came up with this to begin with was when we went to the 300 feet of front footage. People thought they were smarter, and so they said, well, I don't want a 100-foot wide lot. So to meet regulations, and we have some of these out there because we didn't catch it. We didn't create the regulation until a couple of years after people were doing this. So there are some, we call them flag lots, where the one on the right is 300 feet of frontage, so they meet the regulation, but they only wanted a 100-foot wide lot. So they came back about 10 feet off the right-of-way line and shot back over to their 100-foot wide that they wanted to begin with. Or they would angle it like the one on the left. And so that's why we come up with this rule to begin with in the first place. So I'm still for that. I mean, there's exceptions to every rule. I think there's going to have to be a common sense factor involved, like Vicki said. The main purpose is not to let people do something like that.
Right.
It's going to have to be on a case by case, because there's some legal descriptions you can't even describe. Joe will tell you. Like, the reason they say along the creek is because you can't legally describe the center line of a creek. It's impossible.
Go look at some of the old books and pages.
Yeah.
Water trough.
So I mean, you can break it down into curves and spiral curves, but that only gets you so far. Eventually, you're just going to have to say follow the creek because it meanders so crazy. And any physical feature could be that way too, a tree line or an old railroad right of way or something like that. So, as long as it doesn't impede progress, I'm all for it.
That's what we're trying to do, streamline.
Yeah.
One way to look at the lot width to lot depth is to take the average of the two back points and see if that would meet. Is that something that you guys would consider?
Any comment on that, Mr. Surveyor?
Yeah, when you get to the angle lines and you get to your regular, or your roadways.
Excuse me for a second, you need to come up here because we're now recording and I'm not going to have anything that is not recorded. So,
I'm not sure if that microphone's on. Might have to turn it back.
That's all right, they can probably hear me.
Not recorded.
Oh, we're recorded?
yes.
I can hold it like I'm a rock star or something there.
Yes,
There you go.
There you go. I don't think you want me to sing. That's probably no, but
Don't drop that $5 mic.
that's right. Mr. Clint may get me. So when you do have the angled lines, it will create, and Amy and I did talk about what happens if you start having these irregular shaped tracks with, you can't track how deep the lot is. We did talk about the average. If one side's 1,000, one side's 1,300, okay, you can be 1,000, whatever that is, 1,150 deep. Or take the center point of your road frontage perpendicular and go straight to the back line, and that center point has to meet your width to depth. You can't be deeper than that. So there are some options and some scenarios, but like you guys always say, you're never going to cover every situation. You just want to cover most of them, so to avoid having to come back for interpretation.
Apply for a variance.
Apply for a variance, or with the exception policy, I don't know if it would have to go, you could take a track split to the planning commission and then bring it to the board, or if you would just take it to the planning commission. And then that way a board has the power to say to staff, yes, we're good with this, we'll sign off on it.
And I don't think it needs to be held as the same standard as the plat, where you have to do a drainage study.
Right, platting's a different.
That's a whole different animal. You're adding houses, you're adding buildings. We're not.
Well, in some track splits, you are adding houses and buildings, but it's not to the extent of some of the plats.
Well, anybody can add accessory dwelling.
Anybody can add an accessory dwelling if correct.
You're not going to have to do a drainage study on that.
You're correct.
I would just say it's straight line.
I'm going to give your microphone back there.
Thank you.
Chair one.
Thanks.
Well, the development of the policy can take more time than the immediate need.
Yes. So, to answer your question, Commissioner Stephen, to develop a good policy, I think we'll take our time and get that done. I'm not talking about 6 months from now, but I think probably not this planning commission meeting, but maybe the next one we could have something prepared for them. And
Good policy.
Yeah, and again, I want to make sure that to work with the county surveyor so that it's something we can follow and enforce. It sounds to me, what I'm hearing is that the board would like to have as much administrative approval of these as possible, with only on the rare exception they require a exception to go to the planning commission. And I think we can do that, and I think we can do some things in-house, staff-wise, that maybe provides some oversight. So if there is a difference in interpretation, we can get some feedback that way. So we can draft that policy. As far as the track split that brought this up, which is the Murr Farms or Murr Family track split, if the board would like, it's fairly straightforward. It has one break, right? Is that the right terminology? So it has one break where it's not a straight line and it's not a 90. It has one break, and I think that again, what I'm hearing is the commission would like for us to allow that as part of a track split. So I could see that coming back for an exception as soon as next week, if that's what the board wants, because we already have the documents that we need.
Sounds good to me. I just don't think track splits have to go through the planning process where you have to do the drainage study.
And I think that was the intent all along, but I also think that that's why they had the 90-degree rule in there, is that these are supposed to be straightforward. That's why they get
Yeah, no
administrative
ambiguity.
approval.
They're just-
If you can put it on the map and it is square and it meets our depth and width ratio, administrative approval, you're done, you can walk out the door. Anything other than that, you're going to have to get an exception, which means going back to the planning commission. So that's just the way it was at the time. We understand that the current board would like us to change that, and that's what we will do via policy.
But it needs to be done via policy.
Yes,
Yes, and a good policy.
yes. And as we've seen with all policies, you have them in place, you enforce them for a while, you reevaluate.
Right.
So if at some point in time we decide somebody's trying to take advantage of our new policy, we can make an amendment. And if we have something that's tough to interpret, we can also make an amendment. But in the interest of moving forward, we will draft a policy for the Planning Commission to consider in March.
Thank you.
And be on the agenda next week. For the
Next week, we will bring the Murph family track split as
Thank you.
for the Board of County Commissioners.
We good?
Yep. And so we are, just to be clear, Commissioner, Chairperson Cos, are we then adjourning our
We
work
are
session?
adjourned on our work session.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right.
I'm going to put the switch here.